The Exodus, fact or fiction? What if one of the most famous journeys in history never happened? No footprints in the desert sand, no ancient scrolls to prove the escape, just a story told and retold for thousands of years, shaping faith, identity, and hope. But when we step back from the legend of the Exodus, what does history really say? Fact or fiction? Before the Exodus, before the Red Sea parts, before rivers run red and darkness chokes the land of Egypt, the Bible sets the stage for one of its most dramatic and enduring tales, the Exodus. But it doesn't begin with Moses. It begins with Joseph. The book of Genesis tells us that Joseph, one of Jacob's 12 sons, was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. He's taken to Egypt, where against all odds he rises to power, becoming Pharaoh's trusted vizier. Later, a famine strikes Canaan, and Jacob's entire family migrates to Egypt for survival. There, in the fertile land of Goshen, the Israelites multiply into a vast population. It's a powerful story, one of betrayal, forgiveness, and divine providence. But it's also one with no historical anchor. Despite Egypt's famously meticulous record-keeping, chronicling everything from tax grain to tomb construction, there is no evidence of a Semitic vizier named Joseph. No mention of Israelite settlement en masse. No record of a famine-driven migration into Egypt. Not a single inscription confirms the foundational claim that the Israelites were ever there in such numbers. As the story transitions into the book of Exodus, a new Pharaoh arises, one who did not know Joseph. Fearing the Israelites' growing strength, he enslaves them and decrees that every newborn Hebrew boy be drowned in the Nile. Once again, history is silent. Egyptian records, so detailed they note the feeding schedules of temple animals, offer nothing about a large Semitic slave class, much less the state-sponsored slaughter of Hebrew infants. Then, from this darkness, the figure of Moses emerges. Born a Hebrew, placed in a basket and set adrift on the Nile, Moses is found and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. According to the Bible, he is raised in the royal household, alongside Egyptian nobility, possibly even Ramses II himself. He becomes, in effect, a prince of Egypt. But here, too, the historical silence is deafening. No Egyptian text, no temple wall, tomb, or scroll mentions a Hebrew child raised in the court. A prince who would later betray Egypt and challenge Pharaoh would be no minor figure. And yet nothing. It's as if Moses' royal life, like Joseph's high office before him, was written for narrative grandeur, not historical accuracy. As a young man, Moses witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. In a moment of rage, he strikes the Egyptian and kills him. Fearing punishment, he flees eastward into the land of Midian, in what is today northwest Arabia. There he marries into a Midianite family and becomes a shepherd. It's in this foreign land, while tending sheep, that Moses encounters something extraordinary. Atop a remote mountain called Horeb, also known as Sinai, he sees a bush engulfed in flames, yet not consumed. A voice speaks from the fire. It is Yahweh, the God of Israel. But this raises a profound and often overlooked question. Why is the God of Israel speaking to Moses in the land of Midian? Why is the mountain of God not in Canaan, but Arabia? The answer may lie in archaeology, and a radically different origin story for Israelite religion. You see, the mountain where Moses meets Yahweh, Horeb, is not just a backdrop of mystery. It was sacred to the Midianites, and Yahweh, the very name Moses hears from the flames, appears in Egyptian records from this region as a deity associated with southern nomads, specifically the Shasu of Yahweh, a people from the area around Edom and Midian. Some scholars argue that Yahweh was not originally an Israelite god at all, but a Midianite or Kenite deity who was later absorbed into Israelite worship. In this view, Moses wasn't introducing the God of his ancestors. He was encountering the God of his in-laws, a tribal deity from Arabia, transported into the heart of Israel's national myth. And so the man called to liberate God's people carries not only the trauma of Egypt, but the religious DNA of a foreign tribe. Moses returns to Egypt under divine command. With his brother Aaron, he confronts Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Pharaoh refuses, and what follows is one of the most violent and symbolic sequences in the entire Bible. The 10 plagues of Egypt. The Nile turns to blood. Egypt's life-giving river is desecrated. Frogs overrun the land, invading homes, beds, and food stores. Gnats swarm from the dust, filling the air with irritation and disease. Flies cover the land, a symbol of decay and death. Livestock die, destroying Egypt's economy and food supply. Boils break out on skin, afflicting humans and animals alike. Hailstorms crush crops and trees, fire and ice together from the sky. Locusts devour what remains, a second wave of agricultural ruin. Darkness covers the land for 3 days, a direct assault on Ra, the sun god. And finally, the death of every Egyptian firstborn. Each plague is a theological blow, targeted not just at Egypt's economy or people, but at its gods. The plagues represent a cosmic showdown, with Yahweh humiliating the pantheon of Egypt one by one. But once again, we run into a wall of silence. Egyptian records never mention a nationwide ecological collapse. No mass livestock deaths, no mass exodus of Hebrew slaves, and most damningly, no record of the death of the firstborn, an event that would have devastated Egyptian households and dynastic lines. The story is gripping, symbolic, morally charged, but history does not echo its cries. The Exodus. After the dramatic climax of the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Exodus tells us Pharaoh finally relents and frees the Israelites. They depart hastily, reportedly laden with gold, silver, and clothing taken from their Egyptian masters. This swift exit is portrayed as divine justice fulfilled. But this grand narrative quickly turns perilous. Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his army in pursuit. The story reaches its iconic peak when the Red Sea miraculously parts, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground, only to drown the Egyptian forces when the waters collapse back. The Israelites respond with the Song of the Sea, a poetic celebration of their deliverance. But rather than stepping into a promised land of peace, they enter a harsh wilderness, where the biblical account paints a picture of near-constant turmoil. The Israelites repeatedly complain about the scarcity of water and food, despite frequent divine interventions. The Bible describes God providing manna, a mysterious bread from heaven, and quail to sustain them. At Mount Sinai, the narrative shifts to law-giving. Moses ascends the mountain and spends 40 days and nights receiving the 10 Commandments. Exodus 24:18. 10 concise, foundational laws carved on stone tablets. Exodus 20:17, Deuteronomy 5. These commandments include directives such as, "You shall have no other gods before me." Exodus 20, verse 3. "You shall not make for yourself an idol." Exodus 20, verse 4, 5. "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Exodus 27. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Exodus 28. "Honor your father and your mother." Exodus 20, verse 12. "You shall not murder." Exodus 20:13. "You shall not commit adultery." Exodus 20:14. "You shall not steal." Exodus 20:15. "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." Exodus 20:16. "You shall not covet." Exodus 20:17. But these 10 are only a small part of a much larger body of laws. Traditionally, Jewish tradition counts 613 commandments spanning civil laws, religious rituals, dietary restrictions, and moral codes. These are detailed throughout the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, covering everything from prohibitions on mixing fabrics, Leviticus 19:19, to rules on ritual sacrifices, Leviticus 1:7, quarantine protocols for skin diseases, Leviticus 13:14, dietary laws forbidding animals like pork and shellfish, Leviticus 11, and severe penalties, including death for blasphemy or Sabbath violation, Leviticus 24:16, Exodus 31:14. The Bible portrays Moses as a unique intermediary, speaking with God face to face, as a man speaks with his friend, Exodus 33:11, receiving direct revelation and pleading for mercy on behalf of the often rebellious Israelites, Exodus 32:11-14. He is cast as both prophet and lawgiver, establishing a covenant that shapes Israelite identity and society. Yet the biblical narrative also recounts the Israelites' repeated lapses in faith, most famously their construction of the golden calf idol, an act that provokes divine wrath and Moses' fierce response, symbolizing their ongoing struggle to uphold the covenant. Because of their disobedience, the Israelites are condemned to wander the desert for 40 years, a punishment many scholars view as symbolic, representing an entire generation's failure rather than a literal time span. When the time comes to enter Canaan, Moses sends 12 spies to scout the land. The majority report formidable enemies and fortified cities, sparking fear and rebellion. Only Joshua and Caleb urge trust in God's promise. This results in a divine judgment. The disbelieving generation must perish in the wilderness, while their descendants will claim the land. After Moses' death, Joshua leads this new generation across the Jordan River, again depicted as a miraculous parting of waters. He commands military campaigns against key Canaanite cities, including the famous fall of Jericho, where the walls collapse following ritual marches and trumpet blasts. But archaeological evidence challenges these dramatic accounts. Excavations at Jericho show destruction layers dating centuries before Joshua's purported conquest, or suggest the site was unoccupied at that time. AI reveals no sign of a major military defeat corresponding to the biblical narrative. Other supposed conquest sites similarly lack evidence of widespread destruction. Most scholars now conclude that early Israel emerged gradually from within Canaanite society, evolving culturally and religiously over time. The conquest narrative appears to be a later theological construct, designed to unify tribes and legitimize territorial claims, rather than a historical record. Similarly, no evidence supports the mass wilderness wandering, miraculous provision of manna, or golden calf episode outside of Scripture. These stories serve as symbolic lessons about faith, obedience, and divine justice, rather than verifiable history. This disconnect between biblical narrative and archaeological reality is profound. No Egyptian records mention the exodus of a large slave population. No Canaanite cities show destruction matching the timeline. No physical traces of a 40-year desert sojourn exist. What remains is a foundational mythos that has shaped religious identities for millennia, but one that stands on precarious historical ground. Moreover, there is no historical or archaeological evidence for Moses himself, or the claim that he received a comprehensive legal code carved on stone tablets. Scholars widely agree the laws attributed to Moses, the Torah's commandments, were compiled over centuries by multiple authors and editors, reflecting evolving social, political, and religious contexts. Many laws date from later periods, including the Iron Age and post-exilic times. The often cited total of 613 commandments is a later rabbinic tradition, not found in the biblical text. The notion that ancient Israel was governed from the start by a detailed written law code is debated. Early Israelite society was likely structured around oral traditions and tribal customs, with legal codes developing gradually. Moses' portrayal as a direct interlocutor with God and singular lawgiver may function more as theological narrative than historical biography, emphasizing divine authority and legitimizing social order and religious practice. In this light, the Exodus laws and Moses' divine encounter serve important religious and cultural purposes. But as historical fact, they remain speculative and unsupported by independent evidence. The Exodus Decoded, a controversial theory. Simcha Jacobovici and James Cameron's documentary The Exodus Decoded presents a compelling and dramatic theory that natural disasters, notably the massive volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600–1500 BCE, inspired the biblical plagues described in Exodus. The film argues that this eruption triggered a chain of environmental catastrophes that the ancient Egyptians and later the biblical authors interpreted as divine punishment. It suggests the Nile's water turned red from a red tide or algae bloom, mimicking the first plague of blood. Frogs and other animals were displaced by tsunamis and flooding caused by volcanic activity. Ash clouds and volcanic gases produced darkness and respiratory problems, paralleling the biblical plague of darkness. The timing of this eruption roughly aligns with traditional early datings of the Exodus, around the 15th century BCE, giving the theory an appealing chronological framework. The documentary further links the Exodus narrative to the historical Hyksos expulsion, the removal of a Semitic ruling dynasty from Egypt around 1550 BCE. The Hyksos were foreigners who once controlled parts of Egypt before being driven out by native Egyptian rulers, possibly inspiring the biblical memory of a mass Semitic departure. Attempting to ground the story in physical geography, the Exodus Decoded proposes identifications for biblical landmarks, suggesting the famous Red Sea crossing was actually the Reed Sea, a marshy area near the Nile Delta, and highlighting archaeological sites in the Sinai that could be Israelite encampments. Ultimately, the documentary contends that while the biblical account is heavily stylized and theological, it is rooted in real historical events shaped by volcanic disaster and political upheaval. While the Exodus Decoded presents a fascinating, imaginative hypothesis that blends natural science with biblical narrative, it remains a theory with significant scholarly challenges and limited acceptance in academic circles. Critical evaluation of the documentary's claims. Strengths. The concept that natural disasters inspired some biblical plagues is plausible. Volcanic eruptions can trigger climate and environmental effects, lending scientific credibility to parts of the narrative. The Hyksos connection has some historical merit. Historians agree that Semitic peoples ruled parts of Egypt and were expelled violently, which could provide a historical kernel behind the Exodus stories. Weaknesses and criticisms. Dating discrepancies. The Thera eruption is most reliably dated to around 1600 BCE, yet many biblical chronologies place the Exodus either in the 13th or 15th century BCE. This mismatch complicates any direct link. Archaeological gaps. The sites identified in the film as Israelite encampments lack conclusive evidence tying them to the Exodus or early Israelites. Most mainstream archaeologists reject these claims due to insufficient data. Lack of Egyptian records. There are no contemporary Egyptian inscriptions or documents that mention a mass exodus of slaves or any events resembling the biblical story. Overinterpretation and confirmation bias. Critics argue the documentary fits circumstantial evidence to the biblical narrative rather than objectively assessing each piece. It often draws broad conclusions from limited data, blurring the line between hypothesis and fact. Consensus among experts. The majority of professional Egyptologists and archaeologists remain skeptical of any literal mass exodus event. The prevailing view is that the biblical exodus is a theological myth, constructed centuries after the purported events. And if the Exodus story were true, a critical question remains. Why did the powerful Egyptian army not simply march north and retake Canaan, which was under Egyptian control at the time? It would have been a strategically important and secure area for Egypt, not a refuge for escaped slaves. The absence of any Egyptian military response or record of such an event further undermines the historical credibility of the biblical account. In sum, the biblical Exodus story, foundational to many religious traditions, lacks support from archaeology, genetics, and history. It remains a powerful cultural myth, but one that does not withstand critical examination as literal fact. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical. Until next time, this is the Atheist Apostate, signing off for today.